All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving deep, and I mean deep, into the mind of a villain. Not just any villain, either. We're talking about Dr. Edward Richtofen from Call of Duty Zombies. You guys have given us a mountain of in-game dialogue and lore videos to work with, and let me tell you, this guy is,
Yeah.
complicated, to say the least.
Yeah, what's fascinating about Richtofen is that his story, well, it goes way beyond, your typical evil scientist trope. We're going to be looking at his journey across different dimensions, his motivations, how they shift and change. And ultimately, we're going to try and answer, well, a very difficult question. Just how evil is Dr. Edward Richtofen?
So we're not just going to recap, the entire Call of Duty plot. We're really going to try to analyze Richtofen as a character.
Yeah.
And to do that, we got to start at the beginning. Before the zombies, before Group 935 even existed.
Exactly. Even before Group 935, there were already signs, signs of darkness in Richtofen. He was a member of the Illuminati, a secretive group. They sought to control world events from the shadows. And his fascination with torture and information extraction, well documented.
There's this line from his World at War bio that has always stuck with me. It says, he sees no moral distinction between natural death and murder.
Chilling, right?
Oh, absolutely. It suggests a complete disregard for human life, seeing people as mere tools or obstacles in his path. And it's not just an abstract theory either. You know that detail about his childhood collection of stuffed animals, meticulously posed in positions of terror?
Okay, that's just creepy. What kind of kid does that?
Right. It really speaks to a deep-seated fascination with control and suffering. Even at a young age, Richtofen was drawn to the darker aspects of human nature.
So we've established this guy was clearly troubled from the get-go. Then he joins Group 935. This organization dedicated to researching element 115, which, for anyone who's not familiar, is this mysterious element with all sorts of weird effects. Right, and he didn't join them out of some pure scientific curiosity either. He had an ulterior motive: to use Group 935's resources to further the Illuminati's agenda. Playing the long game, manipulating everyone around him.
But he was also a brilliant scientist. Early on, he achieved something pretty remarkable. He teleports a walnut.
A walnut.
Yeah.
Now, that might seem like a quirky detail, but it's actually quite significant. Demonstrates his ambition, his willingness to experiment, to push the boundaries of what's possible. However, it also, highlights his detachment, starts with an inanimate object. But this foreshadows his future willingness to sacrifice living beings for his research.
Yeah, it's like a stepping stone. First a walnut, then who knows what. And as his research progresses, we see element 115 starting to affect him.
Precisely. He becomes increasingly unstable, obsessive, with this mysterious figure named Agatha, who seems to exist somewhere in the dimension created by element 115. Beginning of his descent into madness.
And then he accidentally teleports himself to the moon. This is where things take a really dark turn.
The moon landing is pivotal in Richtofen's story. It's where he encounters the Aether Pyramid, this ancient artifact of immense power. And it really marks his first contact with the dark, otherworldly forces that will shape his destiny.
Okay, I have to admit, even for someone who's played the games, all this talk of element 115, other dimensions, and pyramids on the moon can get kind of confusing.
It's a lot to take in, for sure. Think of element 115 as a kind of bridge between our world and another dimension, a dimension filled with strange energies and powerful beings. The Aether Pyramid acts as a conduit to this dimension, allowing these forces to bleed into our reality.
So that's where the zombies come from.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
But it's also where Richtofen encounters the Shadow Man, this malevolent entity who offers him power and knowledge in exchange for his loyalty.
And of course, Richtofen, being Richtofen, can't resist the temptation. This is where those voices start, right? The ones that drive him further into madness.
You got it. This pact with the Shadow Man is essentially Richtofen selling his soul. The voices begin to torment him, urging him towards ever more ruthless and destructive acts. It's a classic depiction of a Faustian bargain, trading morality for power.
And from the moon, he ends up stranded in a jungle for weeks. He learns about this mysterious Vril energy, gets worshipped by the natives. This must have done wonders for his ego.
The jungle experience further fuels Richtofen's delusions of grandeur, starts to see himself as more than human, a chosen one destined to reshape the world according to his will. And this warped sense of self-importance allows him to justify his increasingly horrific actions.
So he goes from a kid playing with stuffed animals to a power-hungry madman wielding interdimensional forces. That's quite the transformation.
It's a chilling example of how ambition, unchecked by morality, can lead to monstrous consequences.
And that brings us to the ultimate betrayal. Richtofen secretly builds a moon-based Griffin station behind the back of his colleague, Dr. Maxis. He starts using human sacrifices to power this device called the MPD.
The MPD, or matter phase disruptor, a weapon of unimaginable power, capable of warping reality itself. And to fuel this device, Richtofen is willing to sacrifice anyone and everyone who gets in his way.
He casually sends soldiers and scientists to their deaths, treating them as nothing more than disposable pawns in his grand scheme.
It's this casual cruelty that truly solidifies his descent into evil. He's no longer simply ambitious or power-hungry. He's become utterly ruthless, completely devoid of empathy.
And then there's that whole thing with Maxis and his daughter Samantha. That's where Richtofen crosses a line that even as a fan of the zombie storyline, I find it hard to forgive.
Yeah, the events surrounding Samantha's entrapment within the MPD, they're perhaps the most disturbing in Richtofen's story. It's really where his ambition and ruthlessness converge, leading to a truly horrific act.
He basically manipulates things so that Samantha gets trapped inside the MPD, which, if I remember correctly, it's basically a torture chamber of interdimensional energy.
That's a pretty accurate description. Samantha becomes a prisoner within the Aether, her mind warped and tormented by the forces she's exposed to. And Richtofen, despite knowing the consequences, allows it to happen.
This is where I think a lot of players start to see Richtofen as the true villain of the zombie saga. He goes from a morally ambiguous scientist to, like, a full-blown monster.
It's a turning point, not just for Richtofen, but for the entire narrative. His actions unleash a force that he can't control, a force that will have devastating consequences for everyone involved.
But here's where things get even more complicated. We have the introduction of the Ultimus crew, Dempsey, Nikolai, and Takeo. And Richtofen, for reasons that are still not entirely clear, teams up with them.
Ultimus Richtofen. This is where we start to see some hints of nuance in his character. He's still driven by self-preservation, but there's also this sense that he's, trying to undo some of the damage he's caused.
They're trying to defeat Samantha, right?
Yeah.
Free her from the MPD.
Yeah.
But thanks to Richtofen's meddling with time travel, they end up trapped in a cycle of dimension hopping.
Yeah, classic Richtofen. Creating a problem and then trying to solve it in a way that only makes things worse. He's like a cosmic bull in a china shop.
But his motivations are more complex now, wouldn't you say? There's still that ruthlessness, but there's also this desire to fix things, to potentially save the world.
I think it's a bit of both. He's a man haunted by his past, driven by guilt, and this desperate need to control a situation that's spiraling out of control.
So is he less evil in this version? Or is he just a more complicated villain?
It's a question that fans continue to debate. On the one hand, he's still manipulative and willing to sacrifice others to achieve his goals. But there's also this sense of desperation, a flicker of regret that wasn't there before.
Then there's that whole body switching thing on Moon. Richtofen takes control of the zombies. I mean, what was he even thinking?
It's a radical move, driven by the belief that only he can set things right. He's essentially sacrificing his humanity, becoming the very thing he helped create, in order to try and save the world.
But at what cost? He's essentially a puppet master, controlling hordes of undead. That's not exactly a heroic image.
It really highlights the moral complexities of his character. Is he a hero? A villain? Something in between? It's up to each player to decide.
And just when you think you've got Richtofen figured out, another version of him enters the picture. Primus Richtofen. This one's from an alternate timeline. And he's, initially presented as a more heroic figure.
Primus Richtofen is fascinating because he represents a different path, a chance for redemption. He's aware of the horrors that Ultimus Richtofen has unleashed, and he's determined to break the cycle.
He's trying to prevent the apocalypse that he knows is coming, but he's still Richtofen, He collects these blood vials, manipulates another crew, the Victus crew, and ultimately clashes with his Ultimus counterpart.
The blood vials are symbolic of his need for control. Each vial contains the essence of an individual, a piece of their power that he can harness. It's a very literal representation of his manipulative nature.
So even though he has good intentions, he's still using people, still willing to sacrifice others to achieve his goals.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even with the best intentions, the path to hell is often paved with good intentions. Primus Richtofen might be trying to save the world, but he's still tainted by his past, by that inherent darkness that seems to be part of his very nature.
In the end, he sacrifices himself to break the cycle, seemingly accepting his fate, acknowledging his flaws. It's a surprisingly tragic end for a character who started out as a seemingly one-dimensional villain.
It's a complex and ambiguous ending, leaving players to ponder the true nature of his redemption. Did he truly atone for his sins? Or was it a final, desperate act of manipulation?
It's interesting to think about how the writers have played with our perceptions of Richtofen. Over the course of the zombie storyline, he starts as this mustache-twirling villain, then becomes a more nuanced anti-hero. And finally, with Primus Richtofen, we see a glimpse of what he could have been, had he not succumbed to the darkness.
It's a testament to the depth of the character and the willingness of the writers to explore the complexities of good and evil. Richtofen is a character who defies easy categorization, and that's what makes him so compelling.
But the story doesn't end there, right?
Yeah.
We're still left with this lingering question. What about Eddie?
Eddie, the child version of Richtofen created by Dr. Mondi.
Oh, yeah.
This mysterious being who seems to be pulling the strings
Yeah.
behind the scenes,
Right.
Eddie represents both a continuation of Richtofen's legacy, but also a complete unknown.
It's almost like the writers are saying, what happens when you take all that ambition, all that darkness,
Yeah.
and put it into a child who's essentially a blank slate? It's kind of terrifying when you think about it.
Yeah, it raises questions about, nature versus nurture. Is Richtofen inherently evil, or is it a result of his experiences? Eddie, as a child uncorrupted by the world, well, he has the potential to be different, but he's also burdened by those memories and personalities of his older selves.
And we see hints of Eddie's influence, right?
Yeah.
Even in Black Ops Cold War. Remember Requiem? That top-secret organization, they were tasked with investigating these Element 115 outbreaks.
Oh, yeah.
They were constantly stumbling into disaster.
Requiem, with their incompetence, well, they make the perfect pawns for someone like Eddie, who can manipulate events from the shadows. He's like a puppet master, pulling the strings of a world that's already on the brink of collapse.
And there's that chilling quote, Colonel, this threat is real. The entity hides in the darkest of the dark aether. It is waiting for its moment to enter our world and consume it as it has its own. It just sounds like a warning,
It is a warning, but it's also a manipulation, right? Eddie's feeding information to Dr. William Peck, a scientist within Requiem, nudging them toward certain actions that will ultimately serve his own agenda.
So even as a child, he's already playing the same games as his older selves. But what's his end game? What is he trying to achieve with this Project Janus thing?
Project Janus, shrouded in secrecy. But we know it involves harnessing the power of the dark ether on a massive scale, potentially opening a gateway between dimensions. And the name itself is significant. Janus, the Roman god of beginnings, endings, duality, transitions, time, doorways, passages. It suggests a plan of vast scope, something that could reshape reality itself.
And we've seen what happens when the barriers between dimensions weaken, haven't we? Zombie outbreaks, interdimensional creatures, the fabric of reality unraveling. It's not a pretty picture.
No, it's not. Eddie seems to be playing with forces he doesn't fully understand. He's inherited the ambition and ruthlessness of his older selves, but he lacks their experience, their knowledge. It's a recipe for disaster.
It's interesting that you mentioned his lack of experience. He's still just a child, even though he carries these memories of his past selves. Do you think that makes him more dangerous? Or less dangerous?
I think it's a double-edged sword. His innocence, his lack of, a fully formed morality, could make him unpredictable, less constrained by, conventional notions of right and wrong. But on the other hand, his inexperience could lead to mistakes, unforeseen consequences that even he can't control.
And let's not forget about Samantha. She's still trapped in the dark aether, her powers growing, her anger festering. She's another wild card in this whole cosmic mess.
The dynamic between Eddie and Samantha is fascinating. They're both victims of Richtofen's manipulations, both warped by the forces of the dark aether. Will they become allies, enemies, or something in between? It's one of the most intriguing questions left unanswered by the current storyline.
So we've got a child with the weight of the multiverse on his shoulders, a vengeful girl trapped in a dimension of darkness, and this shadowy organization meddling with forces beyond their comprehension. What could possibly go wrong?
That's the question that keeps me coming back to the Call of Duty Zombies storyline. It's a constant exploration of the boundaries of good and evil. The choices we make when faced with impossible odds. And with Eddie at the helm, I have a feeling things are about to get a whole lot weirder.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. From the depths of Richtofen's psyche to the mysteries of Project Janus. This has been a wild ride. And I, for one, am left with more questions than answers.
That's the mark of a truly compelling narrative, wouldn't you say? It leaves you wanting more, makes you think, challenges your assumptions about the nature of good and evil.
So what does the future hold for Eddie? For Samantha? For the world itself? I guess we'll just have to wait and see what the next chapter of the zombie saga brings.
One thing's for sure, it's going to be one hell of a ride.
And that wraps up our deep dive into the twisted world of Dr. Edward Richtofen. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of darkness. Until next time, keep your brain sharp. And watch out for those whispers from the dark aether. You never know who's listening.